Who would have thought that a struggling single mom opening her door during a blizzard would change her life overnight? When Maya shared her last pot of soup with 25 stranded bikers, she thought nothing of it. By the next morning, 1,500 legends were standing outside her home. The blizzard that descended upon the small town of Oak Creek wasn't just a weather event, it was a catastrophe. Meteorologists had warned of a once-in-a-century storm, but no one was prepared for the sheer ferocity of the wind that howled like a wounded animal, burying the streets under 4 feet of snow in a matter of hours. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, a lethal chill that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside her small, dilapidated bungalow at the end of the street, Maya wrapped a third blanket around her sleeping 5-year-old son, Elijah. The house, with its peeling paint and drafty windows, was barely holding its own against the assault. The furnace rattled and coughed, struggling to push lukewarm air through the vents, a constant reminder of the poverty that clung to Maya like a second skin. On the kitchen table, illuminated by the harsh light of a single lamp, lay a bright red eviction notice. It was a final decree, a piece of paper that weighed heavier on Maya's heart than the snow on her roof. She had 3 days to leave, 3 days to find a miracle. She sat there, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot water because tea was a luxury she had run out of yesterday, listening to the wind threaten to tear her fragile world apart. She felt completely and utterly alone, a single black mother fighting a battle against economics and nature that she was destined to lose. Then, the sound changed. Above the wind, a low, mechanical growl vibrated through the floorboards. Maya wiped a circle of condensation from the window and peered out into the white abyss. Headlights cut through the swirling snow, revealing a surreal procession. Motorcycles, 25 of them, huge, chrome-laden beasts, ridden by men who looked like they were carved from granite. They were members of a notorious motorcycle club, the kind of men most people crossed the street to avoid. But nature did not care about reputations. The lead bike skidded on a patch of black ice, nearly tipping over, and the convoy ground to a halt. They were trapped. The snow was too deep for the heavy bikes, and the visibility was zero. Maya watched as the men dismounted. They were large, imposing figures clad in leather and denim, their faces obscured by scarves and helmets. To the naked eye, they looked terrifying, and the neighborhood reacted exactly as expected. Across the street, in the sturdy, warm brick houses of the wealthy, curtains were pulled back. Maya saw Mr. Henderson, a man who had once called the police on Maya for her grass being too long, peer out. She saw the fear in his eyes as he took in the sight of the patch-wearing bikers. To him, this wasn't a group of stranded humans, it was an invasion. One by one, the porch lights of the wealthy neighbors flickered off. The sound of deadbolts sliding home echoed in Maya's imagination. The Johnsons, the Millers, the Clarks, families with generators, full pantries, and guest rooms, chose to lock their doors. They equated the leather jackets with criminality, deciding that these men deserved to freeze rather than be offered shelter. The street went dark, a cold, silent judgment passed by the community. The bikers were left standing in the middle of the road, huddled together against their machines, slapping their arms to keep the blood flowing. They were stranded in a hostile territory that viewed them as monsters, abandoned to the mercy of a storm that took no prisoners. Maya looked at the eviction notice on her table, then back at the shivering men outside. She had nothing to give. She had no heat, no food, and no safety net. But as she watched the neighbors turn their backs, a fire ignited in her chest that had nothing to do with the furnace. The knock thundered against the peeling wood of Maya's front door, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. It wasn't the frantic banging of someone looking for trouble, but the heavy, desperate thud of a hand that was losing its feeling. Maya stood frozen in her hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to bolt the deadbolt, to drag the heavy dresser in front of the door, to hide in the bathtub with Elijah until the storm and the monsters outside passed. She was a single woman with a child. On the other side of that thin barrier stood 25 men whom society had labeled as predators, outlaws, and troublemakers. but the silence from the street was deafening. She knew the Hendersons and the Millers were peeking through their blinds, watching the drama unfold with a mix of terror and self-righteousness, safe in their warm, locked fortresses. If Maya didn't answer, no one would. Swallowing the lump of fear in her throat, Maya tightened the sash of her thin bathrobe and stepped forward. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob. The metal was biting cold. With a deep breath that did little to steady her nerves, she unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack, keeping the safety chain engaged. The wind instantly forced its way in, carrying a spray of ice crystals that stung her face. Filling the narrow gap was a mountain of a man. He was terrifying. He wore a leather vest over a thick jacket covered in patches that Maya didn't understand, but knew were symbols of rank and power. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jawline, disappearing into a beard that was frosted white with ice. He looked like a Viking warlord who had stepped out of a nightmare. This was Big Hawk, the leader of the pack, a man whose reputation usually cleared bars just by walking into them. Maya gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sounding smaller and frailer than she intended. Big Hawk didn't try to push the door open. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. Instead, he did something that shattered Maya's expectations completely. He took a half-step back, showing her his empty, gloved hands in a gesture of surrender. When he spoke, his voice wasn't the growl of a predator. It was the chattering, broken rasp of a man who was freezing to death. "Ma'am," he stammered, his teeth clicking together audibly. I'm sorry. I know how this looks. I know who we are." He gestured vaguely to the dark shapes huddled by the motorcycles behind him. Some of them had fallen to their knees in the snow. "My boys, the bikes won't start. The road is gone. We've been riding for 8 hours." He looked her in the eyes, and in those dark, obsidian depths, Maya didn't see malice. She saw desperation. She saw a leader who was watching his family die and was powerless to stop it. "We don't need food," Big Hawk continued, his voice cracking. "We don't need money. Just a floor, a garage, anything out of the wind, please. If we stay out here another hour, I'm going to lose them." The unsolvable problem of the storm had humbled a giant. Maya looked past him. She saw the younger bikers shaking violently. She saw one man trying to warm another's hands with his breath. Then she looked across the street at the Hendersons' house. The lights were off. They had sentenced these men to death because of their leather jackets. A war raged inside Maya. The logic of poverty and safety told her to slam the door. She had a child to protect. She had no food. She was being evicted in 3 days. She had nothing to offer. But the logic of humanity, the same spirit that had kept her going through years of struggle, told her something else. It told her that a freezing man is just a freezing man, regardless of the patch on his back. "Please," Big Hawk whispered, a single tear freezing on his cheek. Maya looked at the chain lock. Then she looked at the giant shivering on her porch. In a moment that would be gossiped about in Oak Creek for decades to come, an act that the neighbors would later call reckless insanity, Maya made her choice. She slid the chain lock off. She pulled the door wide open, exposing her fragile home to the brutal night. "Get them inside," Maya said, her voice finding its steel. "All of them, before the frostbite takes their fingers." Big Hawk looked at her as if she were an angel descending from the heavens. For a second he didn't move, stunned by the sudden warmth spilling out from the hallway. Then he nodded, a sharp military dip of his chin. "Thank you," he breathed. He turned to his men and let out a sharp whistle that cut through the wind. "Inside! Move! Now!" As 25 freezing bikers began to stumble toward her tiny porch, bringing with them the smell of gasoline, leather, and snow, Maya stepped back to let them in. She didn't know it yet, but by opening her door to the storm, she had just invited a hurricane of change into her life. The transformation of Maya's living room was surreal. 25 men who looked like they could wrestle bears were now crammed into a space meant for a small family. The air, previously cold and stale, quickly grew thick with the humidity of melting snow and the scent of wet leather, diesel, and thawing bodies. But there was no rowdiness, no shouting. The monsters that the neighbors had feared sat on the floor, on the fraying rug, and on the few mismatched chairs with a strange, disciplined quietness. They seemed acutely aware of their size in the fragile house, moving with careful precision so as not to knock over the cheap knickknacks on the shelves. In the kitchen, Maya stared into the open refrigerator. The light inside flickered, illuminating a desolate landscape. A half-empty carton of milk, a withered apple, and a single large pot covered in foil. That pot contained a bone broth stew, a recipe passed down from her grandmother, made from cheap cuts of meat and root vegetables. It was thick, hearty, and most importantly, it was meant to last her and Elijah for the next 7 days. It was their lifeline. Maya looked back at the living room, at the shivering men who were rubbing their arms and blowing into their cupped hands. She looked at the pot again. Without a second of hesitation, she pulled it out. It wasn't enough to feed 25 grown men, not as it was. With a heavy heart but steady hands, Maya placed the pot on the stove and turned on the tap. She watched the clear water swirl into the rich brown gravy, thinning it out. She was diluting her son's nutrition, stretching a week's worth of survival into a single night of charity. She scraped the bottom of the vegetable bin for a few limp carrots and found a loaf of bread that was beginning to go stale. She heated it all up, the aroma of onions and beef slowly filling the house, replacing the smell of wet wool. She didn't have enough matching bowls. She pulled out everything she had, chipped ceramic mugs, plastic Tupperware, even a few glass jars saved for leftovers. When she walked into the living room carrying the steaming tray, the room went silent. Big Hawk was the first to stand. He had shed his heavy leather jacket, revealing arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and loss. But as he reached out to take a bowl from Maya, his hands were shaking not from cold, but from a sudden, overwhelming humility. The bowl was a delicate, floral-patterned teacup that looked comically small in his massive, grease-stained palm. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't complain that it was watered down. He didn't complain that there was no meat in his portion. He held that cup like it was filled with liquid gold. One by one, the men took their portions. "Thank you. Bless you." The words were murmured softly, a chorus of gratitude from men who were used to being screamed at or spit on. They ate with a voracious intensity, the heat of the soup bringing color back to their gray faces. But they ate neatly, careful not to spill a single drop on Maya's worn carpet. Then, a creak from the hallway made everyone freeze. Elijah, rubbing sleep from his eyes, stood in the doorway. He was clutching a ragged teddy bear, wearing Batman pajamas that were a size too small. He stared up at the room full of giants. Maya's breath hitched. This was the moment she had feared, the moment the scary bikers would terrify her son. But the room didn't erupt in noise. Instead, the man closest to Elijah, a bearded giant with a skull bandana, slowly lowered his spoon. He smiled, and it wasn't a wolfish grin, but a genuine, goofy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a shiny silver harmonica. Without a word, he slid it across the floor. It stopped right at Elijah's toes. Elijah looked at the man, then at the harmonica, and picked it up. A small smile broke across his face. The tension in the room evaporated. In the corner, another biker, who had been sitting near the kitchen table, noticed something. The table listed heavily to the left. One of its legs had snapped months ago, and Maya had propped it up with a stack of old magazines. The biker, a man with hands like sledgehammers, set his soup down. He quietly flipped the table over. From his belt, he pulled a multi-tool. While the others ate and watched Elijah play with the harmonica, this man silently went to work. He tightened screws, adjusted the brace, and fixed the wobble that had plagued Maya for a year. He didn't ask for credit, he just fixed it, righted the table, and went back to his soup. Maya stood in the kitchen doorway watching this scene unfold. The gang was eating her week's worth of food, yes, but in return they were filling her cold, empty house with a warmth that the furnace never could. The neighbors had locked their doors to protect their things. Maya had opened hers and found that she had nothing to fear. These weren't monsters. They were just men who were cold, hungry, and incredibly grateful that someone had finally seen them as human. As Maya retreated into the back bedroom to read Elijah a bedtime story, the atmosphere in the living room shifted instantly. The soft murmur of gratitude and the clinking of spoons ceased, replaced by a heavy, observant silence. These were men who lived their lives on the road, constantly scanning their surroundings for threats, for weaknesses, for details that others missed. It was a survival instinct honed over decades, and now, in the quiet of this stranger's home, that instinct turned toward an investigation of their sanctuary. Maya thought she had successfully hidden the depth of her struggle. She thought a smile and a hot meal were enough to mask the cracks in her life. She was wrong. Nothing escaped the eyes of the Hell's Angels. Big Hawk, now warmed by the soup but still wearing his vest like a suit of armor, stood up slowly. He moved with the silent grace of a large predator, pacing the small perimeter of the room. He wasn't looking for valuables to steal, he was assessing the structure. He placed a massive hand against the window frame. He felt the icy draft cutting through the rotted wood. He looked up at the ceiling where a dark, spreading stain marked a losing battle against the elements. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was rhythmic and relentless. In the corner, behind a worn armchair, a plastic bucket was catching steady drops of freezing water from the roof. One of the bikers, a man named Tiny, who was actually the size of a vending machine, walked over and peered into it. He dipped a finger in the water and rubbed it against his thumb. He looked at Big Hawk and shook his head grimly. It wasn't just a leak. The roof was rotting from the inside out. The structural integrity was failing. To a layman, it was just a drafty house. To these men, many of whom worked in construction, mechanics, and trade when they weren't riding, it was a disaster waiting to happen. But the physical decay of the house was not the most damning secret revealed that night. As Big Hawk turned near the kitchen table, the one his brother had just repaired, his eyes landed on the stack of mail Maya had hastily pushed aside to make room for the soup pot. On top sat a piece of paper that commanded attention not because of its size, but because of the aggressive red stamp across its face. Final notice. Big Hawk picked it up. He didn't mean to pry, but the bold letters screamed at him. He read the document in the dim light of the kitchen. It was an eviction notice from a predatory lending company. It detailed a missed mortgage payment, then another, then late fees that had piled up like snowdrifts. The total amount due was $3,400. $3,400. To a club that moved millions in assets, it was a rounding error. But as Big Hawk looked around this room, at the threadbare carpet, the taped-up windows, and the watered-down soup in the cheap bowls, he realized that $3,400 was a mountain this woman could never climb. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The sacrifice Maya had made wasn't just generosity, it was martyrdom. She hadn't just shared her dinner, she had given them the resources she needed to survive the week. She was 3 days away from being thrown into the street with her son, yet she had opened her door to 25 terrifying strangers and fed them without asking for a dime. Big Hawk looked up. He caught the eye of Snake, the club's treasurer, who was sitting by the heater. Big Hawk didn't speak. He simply held up the paper, turning it so Snake could read the red stamp. Snake squinted, read it, and his jaw tightened. The information passed silently through the room like a current of electricity. One by one, the men realized the truth. They looked at the empty soup pot. They looked at the fixed table. They looked at the bucket catching the roof water. Shame is a powerful emotion, but for men like this, honor is stronger. In their world, there is a code. You never forget a debt. And tonight, a single mother with nothing to her name had just put the Hell's Angels in her debt. Maya, singing a soft lullaby in the other room, had no idea that a war council was convening in her kitchen. There were no words spoken, no loud declarations. Big Hawk simply pulled a small notepad from his vest pocket. He clicked a pen. He wrote down the address of the house. Then he wrote down the name of the bank listed on the eviction notice. He tore the page out and handed it to Snake. Snake nodded once. He pulled out his phone. It had no signal in the storm, but he typed a message anyway, ready to send the second the towers cleared. Big Hawk then looked at the rest of the men. He pointed to the ceiling, then made a flat hand motion. the universal sign for level it. He pointed to the window, then tapped his wrist. He was assigning roles: demolition, carpentry, roofing, security. The plan was formed in the shadows, silent and absolute. They weren't just going to wait out the storm anymore. The storm outside had ended, but the storm they were about to bring down on Maya's problems was just beginning. They settled down onto the hard floor to sleep, pulling their leather jackets over them like blankets. But the energy in the room had changed. They were no longer refugees seeking shelter. They were soldiers preparing for an operation. Maya thought she had saved them. She didn't know that by morning they would be the ones doing the saving. The morning sun broke over Oak Creek with a brilliance that hurt the eyes, the light refracting off the pristine white blanket of snow that had smothered the town. Maya woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline of the previous night still coursing through her veins. For a moment she lay in bed, disoriented, listening for the deep baritone rumbles of men or the clinking of metal. Silence. The house was completely, utterly silent. Maya threw off her covers and rushed into the living room, tying her robe as she ran. She stopped dead in the doorway. The room was empty. The 25 giants who had filled every square inch of her floor space were gone. There were no sleeping bodies, no leather jackets, no helmets. The front door was unlocked but pulled shut. The only evidence that they had ever been there was the lingering scent of old leather and the soup pot, which sat on the counter, scrubbed clean and shining. They had left before dawn, disappearing into the white void as silently as ghosts. Maya walked to the window. The street was empty. No tire tracks, the fresh snow had already covered their departure. A heavy stone of disappointment settled in her stomach. She hadn't helped them for a reward, and she hadn't expected a parade, but the abruptness of their leaving felt cold. They had eaten her food, warmed their bones, and vanished without a goodbye. She looked at the fixed table leg and traced the wood with her finger. That was it. That was the transaction. A fixed table for a life saved. She let out a long, shaky sigh. Well, she whispered to the empty room, at least they were warm. But reality didn't give her time to philosophize. The peace of the morning was shattered less than an hour later. It didn't start with a rumble this time, but with the screech of tires and the aggressive slam of car doors. Maya looked out the window again. A black sedan and a sheriff's cruiser had pulled up to the curb, crunching over the ice. Her stomach dropped. It was Mr. Garris. Garris was the representative for the predatory lending firm that held her mortgage. He was a small, sharp-featured man who wore expensive suits that always seemed too tight, as if he were trying to contain a perpetually exploding temper. He didn't walk to her door. He marched, his face red from the cold and indignation. Bam, bam, bam! The knock wasn't a request, it was an assault. It shook the pictures on the walls. Maya, I know you're in there. Open this door or we take it off the hinges. Maya rushed to the door, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She unlocked it and Garris practically pushed his way inside, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. Behind him stood a sheriff's deputy, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Mr. Garris, please, Maya pleaded, backing away. The storm! I couldn't get to the bank. The roads were closed. Excuses! Garris spat, stepping into her living room with muddy shoes, not caring about the carpet. He looked around the small house with a sneer of disgust. You've had 3 months, Maya. 3 months of sob stories. My son is sick. The heating bill. I don't care. This isn't a charity ward. This is a property, and you are trespassing. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and slapped it onto the kitchen table, right next to where the bikers had eaten hours before. Eviction, Garris declared, his voice rising to a shout. Effective immediately. You have until noon to get your junk out of my house. After that, the locksmith comes and anything left inside goes to the dump. Noon? Maya gasped, tears finally spilling over. Mr. Garris, I have a 5-year-old boy. It's 10 degrees outside. Where are we supposed to go? Not my problem, Garris sneered. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a cruel hiss. And don't think I didn't hear about your little slumber party last night. The neighbors talk, Maya. Having a gang of criminals crash here? Trash attracting trash. You've brought down the property value of this whole street enough." The insult cut deeper than the eviction. He twisted her act of kindness into something dirty. "They were freezing," Maya sobbed, falling to her knees. She grabbed the hem of his coat, desperate, abandoning all pride. "Please, just give me one more week. I'll find the money. I beg you." Garrus yanked his coat away as if she were contagious. He looked at the deputy. "Officer, make sure she's out by 12. If she resists, arrest her." The deputy stepped forward, his face sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, you have to start packing." Maya looked out the open door. Across the street, she saw the curtains moving. Mr. Henderson was watching. The Millers were watching. They saw a weeping mother on her knees. They saw the sheriff, and they did nothing. They stood safe in their warm homes, validating their own biases. That Maya was a failure, a nuisance, someone who didn't belong in their neighborhood. Elijah ran into the room, clutching his teddy bear, terrified by the shouting. He buried his face in Maya's neck. Maya hugged him, rocking back and forth on the floor, the cold wind from the open door biting into her skin. She had given everything she had to save strangers, and now, when she needed saving, the world simply stepped over her. She was at the bottom of a deep, dark well, and Garrus was kicking dirt into the hole. "Noon!" Garrus barked one last time, checking his gold watch. "Tick-tock!" The clock on the wall ticked toward noon, each second a hammer blow to Maya's chest. She was frantically shoving clothes into black garbage bags, her tears blinding her as Elijah sat on the sofa, clutching his harmonica and watching Garrus tap his foot impatiently. The deputy shifted his weight, looking at the floor, ashamed of his part in this tragedy but bound by the law. 5 minutes, Maya," Garrus sneered, checking his watch again. "If you're not out, the deputy drags you out. Simple as that." He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, to twist the knife a little deeper, but the words died in his throat. It started as a vibration in the soles of their feet, subtle at first, like a subway train passing deep underground. Then, the picture frames on the wall began to dance. The water in the glass on the table rippled. The vibration grew into a hum, and the hum swelled into a low, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. "What the hell is that?" Garrus snapped, looking around. "Is that an earthquake?" The deputy walked to the front window, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. He peered out, squinting against the glare of the snow. His eyes went wide. His jaw went slack. "Mother of God," the deputy whispered. Garrus pushed past him to look. Maya, clutching a bag of clothes, followed. At the top of the hill that led down into the neighborhood, the horizon had turned black. A dark, metallic tide was cresting the rise, spilling over into the valley. It was a wall of sound that hit them first, a thunderous, synchronized roar of V-twin engines that shattered the winter silence. It wasn't 25 bikes, it wasn't 50. The street was disappearing beneath a flood of steel and leather, hundreds of motorcycles. No, thousands. They poured down the street like a river of lava, row after row, extending as far as the eye could see. The sound was apocalyptic. It shook the snow from the trees. It set off every car alarm on the block, adding a chaotic symphony of sirens to the deep, chest-thumping bass of the exhaust pipes. This was the full chapter. This was every ally, every brother, every prospect within a 3-state radius. They had answered the call. The neighbors, the Hendersons, the Millers, came running out of their houses, not in curiosity, but in panic. They watched as the Legion of Hell's Angels rolled in. The bikers didn't respect the property lines of the people who had shut their doors the night before. They parked on the manicured lawns. They blocked the driveways. They filled the cul-de-sacs. They turned the pristine, quiet suburb into a sea of chrome and black denim. Garrus stumbled back from the window, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Call for backup!" he shrieked at the deputy. The deputy looked at the army outside, then back at Garrus. He actually laughed, a dry, nervous sound. "Backup? Mr. Garrus, there isn't enough backup in the entire state for this." The lead rider, a familiar mountain of a man on a custom black Harley, rolled right up to Maya's curb, blocking Garrus's sedan completely. It was Big Hawk, but he looked different today. He wasn't the freezing refugee from the night before. He was a general at the head of his army. He raised a single gloved fist. Instantly, the roar cut out. 1,500 engines died in unison. The sudden silence was heavier, more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a held breath before the strike. Garrus was trembling now. He looked like a trapped rat. The front door, which he had so arrogantly left open to let the cold in, now framed the terrifying sight of Big Hawk dismounting his bike. Big Hawk didn't run. He walked with a slow, terrifying purpose up the snowy path. Behind him, 50 other men dismounted. Snake, Tiny, and others Maya recognized, along with dozens she didn't. They formed a wall of humanity behind their leader, crossing their arms, their faces like stone. Big Hawk stepped onto the porch. He filled the doorway, blocking out the sun. He looked at Maya, and his eyes softened just for a fraction of a second. Then, his gaze shifted to Garrus. The softness vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory glint. "We heard you were having some trouble with the move," Big Hawk rumbled. His voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute silence of the neighborhood, it carried like a gunshot. Garrus stammered, backing up until he hit the kitchen counter. Now look here. This is private property. I have a court order." He waved the eviction notice, but his hand was shaking so badly the paper made a rattling sound. Big Hawk stepped into the living room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He didn't look at the paper. He looked Garrus up and down, inspecting him like one would inspect a stain on a boot. "Court order," Big Hawk repeated, tasting the words. He took another step. Garrus flinched. "You're trespassing!" Garrus squeaked, his voice cracking. "Officer, arrest him!" The deputy didn't move. He was staring out the window at the ocean of bikers that stretched for blocks. "I think you should listen to the gentleman, Mr. Garrus," the deputy said quietly. Big Hawk reached into his jacket. Garrus gasped, bracing for a gun. Maya held her breath. But Big Hawk didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a leather briefcase. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. It landed with a heavy thud right next to the eviction notice. "We're not here to stop the eviction," Big Hawk said, his voice calm, dangerous. "We're here to settle the account." He turned to the window, looking at the 1,500 men standing in silent vigil outside. Then he looked back at the terrified little man in the expensive suit. "You wanted her out by noon," Big Hawk said. "It's 11:59, and I think you're the one who's in the wrong place." Garrus stared at the leather briefcase as if it were a bomb. His hands shook as he reached out and unsnapped the latches. With a click that echoed in the silent room, the lid popped open. Inside, stacked in neat, crisp bundles, was cash. Tens of thousands of dollars. "That's the $3,400 for the arrears," Big Hawk said, his voice level. He pointed a gloved finger at the first stack. "That's the late fees. That's the interest." He pointed to the rest of the money. "And that is the principal. We're buying the house. In full. Right now." Garrus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked from the money to the giant biker, his brain unable to process the shift. He had expected violence, intimidation, a brawl he could use to press charges. He hadn't expected a buyout. You can't just," Garrus stammered. "Snake!" Big Hawk called out without turning around. From the crowd of bikers on the porch, Snake stepped forward. He wasn't just the club's treasurer. In his civilian life, he was a contract lawyer for one of the biggest firms in the state. He wore his cut over a dress shirt. He placed a document on the table next to the cash. "Purchase agreement," Snake said sharply. "Standard clause, effective immediately. Sign it, take your money, and get off our property." The power dynamic in the room flipped instantly. Garrus wasn't the predator anymore. He was a trespasser. He looked at the deputy, who gave him a small, satisfied nod. Defeated, humiliated, and suddenly very small, Garrus signed the paper. He stuffed the cash into his briefcase, shot one last hateful look at Maya, and scurried out the door, pushing past the wall of bikers who parted just enough to let him flee. As his sedan screeched away, the tension in the room broke. Maya stood frozen, clutching her garbage bag, unable to comprehend what had just happened. You bought my house?" she whispered. Big Hawk turned to her. The intimidating mask dropped, and the gentle giant from the night before returned. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "We bought your house back for you. The deed is in your name. Free and clear." Maya's knees gave out. She didn't hit the floor, though. Big Hawk caught her. He steadied her, his massive hands gentle on her shoulders. "Why?" she sobbed, the relief washing over her like a tidal wave. "Why would you do this?" Big Hawk looked her in the eye. "Because last night, when the whole world closed its doors on us, you opened yours. You didn't ask who we were. You didn't ask what we had. You just saw people in need." He gestured to the door, to the army outside. "We never forget a debt, Maya. You saved 25 of us. Today, 1,500 of us are here to return the favor." He walked onto the porch and raised his hand again. This time he gave a different signal, a swirling motion with his finger. The roar that followed wasn't engines. It was the sound of work. The army mobilized. It was a spectacle of organized chaos. The 1,500 bikers didn't just stand there, they transformed. Leather jackets were shed to reveal tool belts. Helmets were swapped for hard hats. "All right, boys, let's get to work," shouted Tiny. From the saddlebags of the Harleys came drills, hammers, saws, and levels. A convoy of pickup trucks, which had been trailing the bikes, pulled up carrying lumber, shingles, insulation, and new windows. Maya watched in awe as her crumbling home was swarmed by the most terrifyingly efficient construction crew in history. A team of 20 men was on the roof within minutes, tearing off the rotting shingles. Another team was under the porch, reinforcing the foundation. The front door, with its drafty cracks, was taken off its hinges and replaced with a solid oak door that looked like it belonged on a castle. The neighbors, the Hendersons, the Millers, watched from their windows in stunned silence. They saw the criminals they had feared acting as carpenters, electricians, and plumbers. They saw Snake, the lawyer, helping to carry bundles of shingles. They saw Big Hawk measuring the window frames. By late afternoon, the roof was new. The windows were double-paned and sealed. The furnace had been replaced with a brand-new unit that hummed quietly, pumping blessed heat into every corner of the house. The peeling paint was scraped and primed. As the sun began to set, turning the snow pink and gold, Big Hawk walked up to Maya, who was standing on her sturdy, newly repaired porch. He handed her a set of keys, new keys for a new lock on a house that was finally, truly hers. "It's a fortress now, Maya," Big Hawk said, looking at the solid oak door. "Cold can't get in, and neither can men like Garrus." He paused, looking at the army of brothers packing up their tools. "You opened your door when the world closed theirs," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Consider us your new door. We're always open for you." As the last taillight faded around the bend of the snowy road, silence returned to Oak Creek. But it was not the cold, desperate silence of the night before. It was a warm, heavy silence, the kind that settles over a home that is safe, secure, and filled with love. Maya stood in her driveway, her hand resting on the solid oak of her new front door. The house behind her was no longer a shack held together by hope and duct tape. It was a sanctuary. The windows gleamed, holding back the winter chill with ease. The roof was tight and strong. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a testament to the new furnace that hummed in the basement. In just 8 hours, an army of leather-clad angels had undone years of poverty and neglect. Across the street, the blinds in the Henderson house finally pulled back completely. Mr. Henderson stepped out onto his porch. He didn't look at Maya with the usual disdain or suspicion. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and profound shame. He looked at the house that was now the sturdiest on the block. He looked at the woman he had tried to ignore, realizing too late that while he had been protecting his property, she had been protecting humanity. He raised a hand in a hesitant, awkward wave. Maya, with a grace that defined her character, simply nodded back. She didn't need his validation anymore. She had a family now that extended far beyond the property lines of Oak Creek. As Maya turned to go inside, her eyes caught a small flash of color on the frame of her new door. It was a sticker, no larger than the palm of her hand. It was the club's insignia, the winged death's head, intricate and fierce. Big Hawk had placed it there quietly before he left. To the uninitiated, it might look like vandalism. But to anyone who knew the code of the streets, to the debt collectors, the bullies, and the predators like Mr. Garris, that small sticker was a screaming neon sign. It was a seal of absolute protection. It meant that this house and the people inside it were under the eternal watch of the Hell's Angels. It meant that crossing this threshold uninvited would bring down a thunder that no police force could stop. Maya ran her thumb over the sticker. She wasn't just a single mother fighting the world anymore. She was a sister to an army. Inside the warm living room, Elijah was sitting on the new rug, playing a soft, stumbling melody on his silver harmonica. He wasn't playing to an empty room or a stressed-out mother anymore. He was playing with the confidence of a boy who knew he had uncles, thousands of them, out there in the world. Big Hawk hadn't just left money. Before he rode off, he had knelt down to Elijah's eye level. He had placed his heavy hands on the boy's small shoulders and said, "You study hard, little man. You take care of your mama. And when you're 18, if you need a job or a bike or a direction, you come find us. We'll be waiting." It was a promise of a future. Elijah wouldn't grow up as a statistic, a victim of the system that tried to crush his mother. He would grow up with mentors who valued loyalty and honor above all else. The path of his life had been altered not by a lottery win or a government grant, but by a pot of watered-down soup. Maya sat down in her armchair watching her son. She realized then the true weight of what had happened. Economics teaches us that resources are scarce, that we must hoard what we have to survive. But the lesson of the blizzard was different. Kindness is the most volatile, high-risk investment a person can make. You give it away with no guarantee of return. You offer it to strangers who might hurt you. You spend it when you are bankrupt. But when that investment pays off, the dividends are infinite. Maya had judged the bikers by their cold hands, not their rough faces. The neighbors had judged them by their patches, not their hearts. And in the end, the people who looked like monsters turned out to be saviors, while the people who looked like upstanding citizens had turned their backs. As the snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, Maya closed her eyes and listened to the hum of the furnace. She thought about the roar of the engines, a sound she used to fear, but which she knew she would now listen for every single day. It was the sound of her family. The world is full of closed doors, locked tight against the storms of life. But as Maya learned, all it takes is one person brave enough to unlock the chain, to open the door and let the stranger in, to change the course of destiny forever.